I'm Steve Javrik. I'm a research biologist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, centered out of Kentville, Nova Scotia. And we run a landscape ecology lab here, so what we tend to look at is, in terms of bees anyway, is how landscape pattern, so the composition and configuration of the landscape within the agricultural landscape, impacts the abundance and diversity of wild bees, and by extension, their pollination value to the crops here in the Maritimes. When you look at the pollination of crops, there are a few crops that are 100% dependent on pollination. Here in the Maritimes, we think of things like apples and blueberries, and across Canada, there's things like squash and pumpkins, but also canola, especially hybrid canola. This is all 100% dependent on pollination. So you can see that agriculture in Canada goes right back to what pollinates it, or a big percentage of agriculture. And that's the things that directly benefit from pollination. But there's other things too, like the beef industry. We need forage for cattle. A lot of the forage comes from alfalfa. Alfalfa needs bees to pollinate it. So you can see there that pollination's critical to agriculture in Canada, directly or indirectly. Population change. It becomes quite difficult. It seems like an easy thing, but in order to document change, you have to know what the baseline population is. So when you're looking at wild bees, there's not a real good understanding of how populations have been in the past. So it's very hard to detect change, and I think that's one of the critical issues when we're talking about pollinator decline, or trying to find out what is impacting native bees, is to really document what's there. But having said that, there are a few examples in Canada, and one that's very relevant to the Maritimes, that we actually have seen a change in bee populations. And that's an example of a bumblebee that used to be very common in the Maritimes. What happened is that this bee used to make up about between 50 and 60% of our native native bumblebee populations here in the Maritimes. But in the mid-90s, we started to see that species decline, and it started to decline dramatically. What was going on at that time is another bee was brought in for pollination of things like tomatoes in greenhouses, and it had a pathogen that got into the wild bee populations, and all of a sudden you started to see huge declines. I think with honeybee populations, this is a story that's become well known. I think now if you look at what we've been hearing in the media over the last few years about colony collapse disorder, which was occurring in the United States, we see that honeybee populations are on the decline.
Yeah, so this farm belongs to Alan Stewart, and he's been farming here for the last 25 years, and he's been organic since then, so he started as an organic farm right at the beginning, and Jelly and I came 5 seasons ago. So I think organic farming really focuses on biology and understanding sort of the cycles within the farm and how to use them and support them so that you get a good crop production, but that at the same time you're also increasing the quality of the soil and maintaining the care of the water, and things like bees and the animals and insects on the farm are also being supported and cared for. At this farm, we don't spray anything. Yeah. Like there's nothing. There's lots of organic things that you can spray, but we don't tend to. We try to keep it quite low input. But there are things like you know in the valley at this point, you can't really grow organic apples without spraying them.
Yeah.
So we grow them organically without spraying, but we press them all into cider because the taste is fabulous, but aesthetically they're hard to sell in the market. Like my sense of the whole thing is just that bees play like a really important part in the growth of crops, and that in the area actually there's a lot of Cosman and Whiddon is like a huge, and they have hives everywhere around the valley.
Our farm's Appling Farm Incorporated, and it's located in Morristown, which is south of Berwick. And we have actually, it's a multi-generational family farm, and we've actually been there for better than 30 years. We use insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides in our spray program. We put on approximately 12, 13 sprays a year. Usually they're 7-day intervals, sometimes it's spread at 14-day intervals, starting in early May, late April, early May, depending on the season, usually concludes by late July. I mean, this whole bees for blueberry pollination, it's probably been around now for probably 20 years, 25 years, and I think we've been a bee yard for them since close to the beginning of that. We have approximately 100 acres of apples, between 80 and 100 acres, and we have 2 bee yards in that operation, and they're bees that are actually owned by Bragg Lumber, and so we have about 100 hives in each of those 2 operations. And I personally, I've not seen any decline. We've never had a crop failure, I don't think, as a result of poor pollination.
I started beekeeping in 1980. About 1990 or 91 before I was really making my whole living at it, but since then we've made our entire living from beekeeping. We have 1,500 beehives. Like I was telling you, the main revenue stream is from honey production, from renting our bees for pollination, and from beeswax as a sideline. When I was young, we would lose about 10% of our hives in an average year. Now 30% is normal, and we have years where we lose 50%. It was very serious. I mean, beekeepers in Ontario, we've lost huge amount of bees this year. Colony collapse disorder, which has never been identified in Canada, but which was in the news for a lot in the U.S. You know, it's never been pinpointed what the cause of that was, whether it's insecticides or virus, or there's a lot of unexplained issues for sure.
I don't know if people are necessarily understanding, first of all, the implications of not having enough pollinators, but also how their choices on a day-to-day basis impact that situation.
What happens if there aren't enough honeybees around? Or if there's not enough bees, does this impact our ability to feed ourselves? I think the answer to that is yes. When you consider 1 out of every 3 mouthfuls of food depends either directly or indirectly on a pollinator, I think that really pinpoints how critical pollination is, and it's something that we really have to get a handle on.
I think that an awareness is growing around the issue. I don't think it's particularly clear what to do about it. Like, I don't know how strongly, I think, from what I've read recently, some of the biggest issues around the die-off have been, their most recent research is showing that it's likely pesticide use that is contributing to some of the die-off. But I think in general, it's just like one piece of a much larger issue.
I mean, in an ideal world, it would be an organic world, but I don't know if we can feed the population of the earth in an organic world. Beekeeping became exponentially harder in about early 1990s when the varroa mite arrived here, which is a parasite of mite that bites and sucks the blood of bees. It's just a really devastating pest of honeybees.
These drivers, such as pathogens or pesticides or habitat quality, don't act in isolation. A lot of times one of these things can compound another effect. So what we're starting to do now is look at these things together. How do these things come together to really define what native bees we have there and how many of them are available to pollinate our crops, but also to look after the natural ecosystems that are intertwined with agriculture, because just as bees are important for agriculture, they're really keystone species that hold a lot of our natural systems together too. So I think if you look at a diversified pollination strategy for our crops, you don't want all your eggs in one basket. You don't want to depend 100% on honeybees. You don't want to depend 100% on native bees, but you want both of those things to be very strong. So if something happens, like colony collapse disorder, or something else that impacts honeybees, maybe wild bees can slip in a little bit more and take up some of that slack. But in order to look after wild bees, we have to find out what they need in the landscape and how we're impacting that. What guidelines or what can we do to improve the landscape for wild bees? And this is the research that we're starting to do right now. Can we create blueprints within agricultural systems that can be implemented by producers that will help wild bee pollination, not just now, but 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, and much further down the road.
There's a lot of wildflowers and plants growing all over the farm all of the time. There's certain areas in particular, but we don't any land that isn't being used for vegetable production is, things are growing on it all of the time. There's a lot of wildflowers around. We also use buckwheat as a cover crop. So basically meaning like when we're not using the land, we plant the buckwheat, and then we just before it goes to seed, we till it back under to add organic matter into the soil. And so to increase the fertility of the land, and also to always keep something on it. And the bees, one of the things I thought of the most is that they love the buckwheat flowers. Like the whole patch will just be humming, like really loudly humming, because they love them. And so I think those are sort of the main things that we do here.
The area where we are is very stony, and so we have a lot of like ancient rock piles that this land has been cleared over the years, and they say that's another prominent habitat for wild bees. And so because of this, the location of our farm and a lot of woods around in the area, forest area, and as well as these stone piles, I think we have a relatively healthy supply of wild bees.
And again, like anything, these things don't happen across the board. There are certain groups within, let's say, a commodity that will start to adopt these things quicker than other groups, and it's just what their production philosophy is.
So even though you're sort of taking specific measures on your own particular farm, that the bees don't really follow the same kind of boundary lines. So to me, it's like a much bigger community issue. It's not like, it's important what you do on your own farm in order to support them in any way that you can. But you also recognize that the broader practices that are being engaged by farmers actually matter. I think all farmers really love their land and care about it. And whether they're a conventional farmer or an organic farmer.
I work with bees. I've been stung by lots of them. So that's talk about honeybees. So I'm well aware of what part of the role they play in our operations. Our spray program will always be conscious of bees and bee flight in the orchard, and we'll certainly do our part to try to prevent aggravating that in any way.
I was working with a blueberry producer in Prince Edward Island. Well, he saw one of our talks on this, and he came up to me after the talk and he said, I've spent the last 2 years removing all the wildflowers from my system because I thought they weren't good. So now what he's done in the last couple of years is start to establish native plant populations within his production area in a way that they don't create weed problems on his field. He's put them in places where spray drift on those wild plant populations is minimized. So there's a real example of getting the message out, delivering the science to a producer, and he's actually starting to do that. And he's not the only one. Yeah. So now, with some of the work we've done here, when new blueberry land is produced, it's not just cutting down every tree and creating what we call these big blue deserts. There's little bits of habitat that are left in strategic places to accommodate the nesting and feeding requirements of wild bees that this crop depends upon quite heavily right now, and probably to a greater extent in the future.